For an entire generation of South African cricketers, the international game was a mythical world. But despite the international isolation, cricket survived and lived in the country.
Black people lived there, white people lived here, you all went to your own schools, there was no integration. I didn't know better, to be honest with you. We thought, hang on, there's going to be bombs are going to go off here. These guys are now going to travel around the country. Where are they going to stay? You know, this is like guys arriving from outer space. And I'm not exaggerating.
On the show today, we hear from a man who lived an unexpected dream.
So I said, look, I want 10 test hundreds and I want to play everybody home and away.
Daryll Cullinan relives the journey that took the South Africans from forgotten men to international stars. Daryll, thank you so much for doing this.
No, it's fantastic to join you, Gaurav, and it's a real honor. Thank you.
Let's just begin by looking back at that time. Did you grow up in South Africa wanting to be a professional cricketer, knowing that the country was out of the world game?
Well, growing up, one didn't really fully understand, firstly, the politics of the day, and there was a bigger game in terms of international cricket. We were pretty much isolated. You knew about it, but your, I would say, primary goal was to do well at first-class cricket. And it was more the ambition of playing county cricket, because that could offer you a living. And growing up, I really enjoyed squash more, but my father said, no, you won't make a living out of playing squash, stick to your cricket. But we always had the intention to go on and study. So cricket became the means to get to university and qualify. And in some ways, if you didn't embark and go and play overseas, it was secondary in your life. But international cricket, no, didn't know much about it.
Because here you are, a teenager, emerging and starting to catch the eye of coaches. You obviously had talent, you obviously had a feel for the game, but you're saying you had absolutely no idea that there existed a higher plane of the game, the highest level of the game.
Well, you know, I grew up in a town called Queenstown. It was named after Queen Victoria. I went to school named after as well, Queen's College. We had a really good, strong cricketing tradition. It was the school of Tony Greig, Kenny McEwen. They had a long relationship with professional cricketers from Sussex. So they would come over and spend the summer with us. Once a year, perhaps, we would see, I recall, it was the NatWest final, if it was still called in those days. So that was the sum total of what we knew was international cricket. And that wasn't even Test cricket. I remember our professional, my grade 10 and 11 and 12 year. It's a guy, Bob Jones. And he was the one stage, he was the head coach at the Lord's Indoor School. And he really obviously loved cricket. So we formed a cricket society. And what he would do is, he'd bring over the old VHS tapes.
Yeah.
And we paid 50 cents in those days to be a member of the cricket society. And we sat there and we watched the highlights of whatever Test cricket had been there that summer. I think we got the Cricket Monthly at that stage. I think it would probably be what we know as the Wisdom these days and that sort of thing, magazine. And so we can entirely cut off. And I think people actually appreciate that today, to understand what it really meant. They may sort of look at you and say, oh, what about apartheid? What were you aware of and why didn't you? And that type of thing. Our schooling was one of that, where the history of the past at that time was what we knew, which was the nationalist government. Black people lived there, white people lived here, you all went to your own schools, there was no integration. And we were cut off. Television only arrived, I think, in 76, 77, 78. That was controlled. So everything in terms of, we were conditioned and to believe a certain thing. So that probably played a role in, doing well at first class level and wanting to do well, because that in many ways was all the cricket someone like me knew, and that's what I aspired to be, was a very good first class cricketer. In 83, we went on a schoolboy tour. Which then would have been the South African under 19 side. But we were known as the Albatross 11. And we got together in Johannesburg, and we were not allowed to take any cricket equipment. When I say not even a shirt, nothing. We were just a group of young students travelling to the UK on a sightseeing tour, or cultural, educational tour. And when we arrived at Heathrow, we were had to break up and then go through customs. We had obviously had passports and kind of told what to say, and they'd put money on each of our passports. And Jimmy Cook was with us on that trip. It was a good side. We had Salih Nakaddeen. I think he was the only non-white cricketer we had in those days. And Shukri Conrad, he was the other one. So we were told, once you leave, we followed Jimmy or the manager, and then we got together in the bus terminal. And that was the... and then we had...
What were the names of the world? What did that mean to you? Just stepping back a little bit, 12, 13 years old, there's already these... There's a bit of history in the game. There's all of that. There's names like Gary Sobers and Don Bradman. To a young Daryll Cullinan, did that mean much?
Just in terms of reading up about the game, obviously knowing the history of the game, having an interest in the game, because, as you said earlier, there was no internet. So you were told as a young cricketer, if you want to be a good cricketer, make sure you read cricket books. And we'd have a few at the school library. And but the significance of Bradman, I think, really came, I speak for myself, when we got back into international cricket. Then you suddenly, it was a whole new world here, and you realised, hang on, who are these guys? And you really got to understand.
That late, when you got into international cricket. There was this great South African team, the last team that played international cricket before the isolation years began. Pollock and Bacher and Proctor and names of that kind. As a young man, what were those influences like on your cricket? Because here were guys who were taken away from the world game in their prime. Were they big heroes in South Africa?
Well, my sort of era, early 70s, we were still young kids, so we knew of them. Graham Pollock was the icon. Barry had left. He played most of his cricket Australia and England, whereas Graham never did. So he was the player that everyone looked up to, wanted to be, and was a true star. And didn't quite understand and appreciate how good he was. I think when I speak of my generation, we played with him, I played against him. And he was at the end of his career then. And again, once we got back into the international cricket, did you actually then realise and appreciate?
Yeah.
And I remember our first tour to England. As England tour goes, there's a lot of functions, and the major one was a hotel at Piccadilly Circus, and Mike Proctor was our manager, and Mike Proctor was the coach, excuse me, and Graham had been following the tour, and so they were invited to this luncheon, and the team was introduced, and when Mike Proctor was introduced, they stood up. And when Graham was introduced, the audience, they stood up. They obviously knew Barry was, and they remembered Graham's innings at Trent Bridge when he got that brilliant 120 odd under those conditions, which was an exceptional knock. But in terms of an influence, in terms of where we were going, not knowing that we'd ever get back into international cricket, it was not something that you believed was going to happen. It was, well, that's it. That's just our lot. And if you wanted to play international cricket, you would look elsewhere. Either England or New Zealand, Australia, which I seriously considered, and I had the opportunity to go to New Zealand and go to Australia. So I think to answer your question, Gaurav, it's not like a kid growing up today. He's grown up with international cricket. He knows who the superstars are. It's a different world today.
Because at 15 and 16, here you are, an extremely talented batsman, and already comparisons with Graham Pollock start to come about. What was that like for a 15, 16-year-old to suddenly be compared to the greatest batsman South Africa have produced?
Yes. I think to a large degree was because of our isolation. They were looking for heroes. I don't think cricket news as such was so internal that there wasn't much of a story to it all. But I was 16 when I broke his record, so obviously that caught the attention, and comparisons were made. But it didn't take long to realise that those comparisons were a little bit unfair. But it just was the nature of our cricket, and you know. But it kind of made me sit up and say, look, you know, you've got a future. You can play a bit, and right now, where does it take me?
Let's talk a little bit about apartheid, about the policy, about cricket around it, and that being a very abnormal time as a society. Were you inherently aware, Daryll, that this is a white man's sport, that this is divided along those lines? Cricket is very much what white boys do, and other members of society are actually kept away from that game. What was it like? Was that very much part of the culture of how you grew up in South Africa?
Very much part of the culture. If you looked upon it, that's just the way it was. I've been white. I went to a white school. I played, cricket at that school. Played all our sports. Black kids grew up. They grew up in the townships. That's where they played their sport. We always grew with the belief that there was equality in our society. That's what you thought.
You didn't think it was unfair?
I didn't know better, to be honest with you. And if had you grown up in either very liberal family, at school the politics of the day were taught as per the nationalist government and what apartheid was about, even when I got to university. And there were rumblings, particularly when I got to university. That was the middle 80s, when things were really starting to hot up. And there was unrest in the townships, and I had friends who'd done their military training. If you studied, you could delay till late, and that's what I did. We were in the townships. There was a curfew. Things were really, really starting to become problematic for the apartheid government. So there was that side. It's like I say to people, I had two halves in my life, two halves in my career. Grew up in that era, and I grew up in this one. And if people ask me, or tell me about your career, I say, well, it's been a very interesting one. But as a young white South African growing up, no. And we didn't see anything abnormal about that. We didn't think, well, hang on, no. We need to do something about it, because around you, what you read, what you saw, who you interacted with, that just the way it kind of was. And
Did you never play cricket with black kids? Were there any black kids? Never. You never came across anyone, colored kids? No one came and played cricket with you?
No, not at all. Well, what really, and I often think about it today, is where I grew up, the public playing facilities, which are now part of the school that I went to. It was called the recreational ground, and they had 2 rugby fields. In summer it was a cricket field, and alongside it was a soccer field. And when I say it was down the road, it was literally 100 meters away. And with nothing better to do during the holidays, our days were sport. So you went out, and whatever you found, you could play, with us. Cricket, tennis, squash. And it was winter time, so we'd pick up a game of rugby amongst a couple of friends. I would have been 10, 11 at that stage. Touch rugby, and we'd play for hours. And then I remember the one holiday, there were about 4 black kids who came and played with us, so they joined in. And we spent an hour or 2 playing, go home, and my mom would have lunch for us and that sort of thing. And then they were brilliant, and the company was great, and we really, like kids, we had a fantastic time. And then we would sort of arrange, are you guys coming the next day? And we wouldn't see them, and then they'd come, we said 10 o'clock, and they'd come at 12, and that type of thing. And couldn't understand why, so it was very disappointing for us, and perhaps they didn't want to play with us, or this and that. But then in time, only later, got to understand that they would be coming into a white area. And what would happen is, and particularly where I grew up, that was the boiling pot of South African politics. That was the home of the ANC, the ZAPU, which was the real right wing of that movement. Late 80s, they planted a few bombs, one in East London, in Queenstown. My 2 brothers almost walked into that, were it not for lack of parking in front of the family restaurant. So they had to go up the road and come back, and then this. But they placed it incorrectly. It was a limpet mine. So understood later that they would be dodging the police, and if they got caught, they would be chucked in the back of a van and maybe given a hiding, or driven back to the townships. And there was times time's 2 in the afternoon, and they said, no, we've got to go now, we've got to go now. Oh, come on, play. No, we have to go now. Because there'd be a curfew. They didn't want to be caught, after dark. And it left an impression on my mind to this day. And that kind of, if I think back on it, then you think now, what the real issues and how shameful it was and how hurtful it would have been. And it was a huge, huge travesty of justice, really, that so in many ways we lost so much talent. Even today,
all these years later, that now seems to be a grotesquely unfair time as a society. But at that time, even as a 14, 15-year-old, it was just the way things were. Is that what you're saying?
When you tell people that, they, no, come on. But it was, it was indoctrination. It was, you could call it that. And that's just, the shadow that we grew up under, not knowing better, not understanding better, your parents not knowing better. It was in Afrikaans there's a word called the swart gevaar. It was the black danger. P.W. Botha was then Prime Minister. And there was a war going on in Angola between our troops supported Southwest Africa, which was then now Namibia today, and Zimbabwe with the transition there. And friends of mine fought in that. So on two fronts we were supporting, taking on the Russians. So you had the swart gevaar, the black danger, and there was the whole, it was communistic, and they were coming in to take over the country, and it was that sort of danger. And that's in many ways how we grew up. But there was because things were so tightly controlled and segregated, there was no violence in those days. You didn't know better. But with the political uprising in the middle 80s, you started to be aware. And at that stage I was at university. Suddenly the whole new world, you were thinking. But I remember 85 was my first year at university. I was 18, 19. And we had one particular lecturer doing political science. And he was already talking about alternative teaching going on in the townships. They're not teaching the curriculum as we know it. And the change already happened. You kind of looked at, what a liberal, which side are you supporting? But it was true. It was already happening.
So since you mentioned the rebel tours, and you've touched on it earlier, there were quite a few. What was the arrival of these cricketers like for you, and what kind of impression did it leave on you, especially because some of them were truly world-class, top-notch players, and you said yourself that the likes of that hadn't been seen in South Africa. So just can you share memories of being around these games?
The Sri Lankans arrived. Tony Apatha's touring squad. He arrived as the manager, and by the third test was their best bowler, because they really battled. I mean, they ran into guys like Pollock, who was still hungry, and a good team around them. But then I was still at school, so we were kind of picking up on it. It was televised. The national broadcaster televised all those games. It was more that sort of experience. But then once the West Indians arrived, then I was in my final year at school, and got out to watch quite a bit of that. No, I think it was earlier, probably 82, 83.
I was like, suddenly here they are, black cricketers, so skilled and so good. Was that an eye-opener?
Well, absolutely. Well, again, arriving in white South Africa, we thought, hang on, there's going to be bombs are going to go off here. These guys are now going to travel around the country. Where are they going to stay? They can't stay in white hotels. Well, what are the extremists going to say? So they actually became honorary whites. And they were so loved. But all these sorts of things, we thought, well, this is like guys arriving from outer space. And I'm not exaggerating. But we were so hungry for cricket. I think that was the huge excitement that, come on, let's just play cricket. I mean, guys like Collis King, he was 76, I think he was a hero. The brand of cricket they played. I mean, Clark, I was saying earlier in that my second season with Border, I got to bat against him. With half a helmet, not much of a thigh pad as a kid. I got cold today when I think about it. They created enormous excitement. We were so hungry. We could have watched anything. Lawrence Rowe and the style of cricket they played
Do you remember that time as being particularly challenging? You mentioned the fears that were there about bombs going off, etc. But what about the politics that surrounded their arrival? There was, of course, a lot of opposition to the idea of playing any kind of cricket against a regime such as South Africa. But within the country itself?
We weren't made aware of that. We weren't, it wasn't sort of spoken about. Certainly not on television, in the media, because it was state controlled. It was a shutdown. And the resistance that you saw when Gatting's tour came, I played in Pietermaritzburg, where Gatting went to face there was a huge black crowd. And we can get to that because that's an interesting story.
Yes, please.
But again, and the opportunity or the chance or the platform for those against those tours, that particular tour and the Sri Lankan tour and the first English tour, it wasn't there. The clampdown, it was just not going to happen.
So there was no idea that these guys are risking their international careers. They're going to get banned in their countries.
No, we kind of got that. That was spoken about, but it wasn't sort of a struggle between them and what's right and wrong and should we or not. They've given us the best cricket present in 25, 27 years. This is fine, let's go and play cricket. The resistance to it, we weren't aware of that because it wasn't reported, it wasn't seen. People weren't, there wasn't going to be any issues at the grounds. And again, as I said earlier, Gaurav, you were just in that sort of space, not knowing, we weren't sort of totally blind to it, but not really knowing what actually was happening here. And yes, they were facing not going, it was mentioned or spoken about difficulties in going back. What would happen if they went back to the Caribbean, coming to, you can imagine, apartheid South Africa. And the 96 World Cup was the first, I'd say, enforced selection when they picked Paul Adams when Nicky Boyer should have gone. Now some may say, well, we could understand Adams' selection. He'd got test wickets. With his freakish action, he was difficult to pick and that sort of thing. But if you think of the quality cricketer Nicky Boyer was, he should have gone. We all knew that. A meeting was called. Bob Wilmer wasn't there. He was the coach at that time, and he had said, right, it's on the table. This is the amount. We're all in or all out. What do you guys think? And it came as no surprise to us because you obviously knew there were things going on.